Good afternoon. Welcome to our, we call it AI and Arts conversation, although we won't be talking about AI, but about art and cosmology. I'm very grateful that you managed to come here in spite of the hot weather. I'm surprised that so many showed up, and you will be rewarded not only with a great talk, but also afterwards we'll have a small apéro. So please don't run away and don't go into the river immediately. I'll make a small introduction to Omar, Nasim, and Rohini Devasher. I'm a little bit nervous because Omar said it has to be a good introduction. So I hope I will manage. Short is, oh, that's even more challenging. So we have here to my right side, Omar W. Nasim. He is an award-winning historian of science, and currently he holds a professorship in the history of science at the Institute for Philosophy at the University of Regensburg in Germany. He's a specialist in the visual, cultural, and material histories of science and technology in modern Western Europe, USA, and Great Britain. Nasim has held fellowships with the Bossius Center for History and Humanities and Science in Amsterdam, the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin, the Kunsthistorische Institute in Florence, the Newton International Fellowship at Oxford University, the Chair for Science Studies at the ETH Zurich, and the NCCR's Iconic Criticism Project at the University of Basel, and the DAAD Graduate Exchange Fellowship at the University of Constance. I would have said something about two of his books, but we keep it short. So one of them just appeared 2 years ago. It's called The Astronomer's Chair. It appeared with MIT Press in 2021. And the other one is called Observing by Hand from University of Chicago Press in 2013. And as you can already hear from the titles of the books, which are in a way exemplary for Omar's research, we are here in the right place to talk with Omar about his work. And joining us via Zoom, unfortunately she couldn't come due to personal family accidents, so to say, is Rohini Devasher. She is an Indian artist currently in Delhi, and she's trained as a painter and printmaker, working in a variety of media, including video, prints, and site-specific drawings. Her current research brings together her interest in early scientific observational instruments and contemporary observational sciences, specifically astronomy and atmospheric science. To study the twin aspects of the Earth's skies, its celestial constants on one hand, and the mutable objects of the atmosphere on the other. Rohini will actually be in Switzerland very soon, in August, I think, for Arts at CERN in Geneva, an artist residency. And she's also exhibiting a work here in the exhibition Data Alchemy, which you can see in the labor in our small cinema, which is called Glasshouse Deep. So with no further ado, I'll hand over the microphone to you.
Thank you so much, Adrian, for this introduction and for this opportunity and for this invitation to share some ideas with you. Just a little bit of context here. I'm not going to give a talk. I'm not going to give a speech. I'm going to say a few words to begin a conversation with my colleague Rohini. And this is going to be basically a historian of astronomy and science, thinking about data together with somebody who actually actively uses data in her own artistic work. What you're seeing on the screen are images that will be playing throughout that come from both of our works. Some of them directly from Rohini's own artworks, and some of them directly out of my archival research in multiple archives around the world that I work with. And some of the images are also from books or things I've published. So that's going to be playing in the background. It's going to be informing, hopefully, what we say. And we put this together basically quite quite haphazardly, and it just shows how deeply intertwined what Rohini and her interests are and my own, coming from completely different worlds and angles. So it's a nice happy coincidence, or it's not a coincidence. That's where we will begin. So we will think today together about patterns, data, and astronomy, whether it's coming from the sciences or from the arts. I like to begin with this room. It is the Meridian Room, one of the central rooms to any observatory. It is the heart of the observatory. This is where the astronomers would actually use a kind of telescope called a meridian telescope that had its axis on the south and north poles, running up and down. Actually, I'm not sure where south and north here are, but I presume it would be this way. And basically, it was a rigid telescope, and it wouldn't move across the sky. Rather, it would point in one direction and wait for the stars to come to it, and it's basically its target through the microscope of the telescope. And this was used to tell time. So time determination, which was the bread and butter of most observatories of the 19th century, such as this one, was done and executed here. Now, astronomy is one of the oldest sciences, but it's one of the oldest sciences that have dealt with data. It's been gathering data from literally day one. Some of the oldest records we have in astronomy are the cuneiform from Mesopotamia that actually have star charts meant to tell time. In their case, it would have been for the calendars, not for the seconds and the minutes as we function today. But at the heart of astronomy is telling time. At the heart of telling time are rooms like this. At the heart of rooms like this are data gatherings. Every day, the astronomers will come in at a very specific moment, usually twice a day, and they would gather the data required for the time determination for that day. Why would they be doing that? For multiple reasons. They need long time baselines, but they also needed time to sell. So the most famous case of this is in the Jura Mountains in Neuchâtel, in the observatory there. As you guys know, this is also the clock making industry in the Jura Mountains. The Neuchâtel Observatory there, its Meridian Room, was central to the watchmaking commercial industrial complex of Swiss watchmaking. And it was the place where it distributed time across the board to the watchmakers, so they could all determine their time exactly together. Data also has a commercial aspect, right all the way back to at least the 1700s, if not earlier, when it comes to time distribution and the commercialization of time itself, again, based upon the data that's gathered in places like here. Data, we want to argue, must be contextualized in such ways. What I've just done, is I've contextualized data. Now, the data here would be gathered in notebooks, and these notebooks will pile up over years and years. Where they would be stored became major questions. How they would be stored became major questions. Their maintenance also became major questions quite early on. In fact, in the case of the cuneiform, it's literally chiseled into rock. That's how the data has been stored. And that's why we still have it to this day. Now, that's also a big question in astronomy, is how will we maintain and preserve and sustain this data over long periods of time? Now, Rudolf Wolf, who was the astronomer here, he wasn't always so concerned with the Meridian Room. He probably left that to his assistants. His major concern for 46 years of his life, every day, was to look at sunspots and to draw them and to note them and to take notes for them and to put them into numerical forms. imagine the amount of paperwork that went into 46 years every day checking the sun when the sun was available here for the determinations of the patterns to be found in the sunspots. And over those 46 years, he was the first to determine from that data, which had to be analyzed, not just preserved. He found patterns for the first time that the sunspots on the sun actually have a cyclical pattern to them. Over 55 years, you will find a cycle to them. That was first discovered here based upon tons of paperwork, huge amounts of notebooks and pen and ink, and the materiality of data also here needs to be forefronted. As a historian of astronomy, I am particularly interested in the ways in which astronomers took notes for the purposes of data collection, and how they use those notebooks in multiple ways, how they stored them, and how they actually accessed them later so basically how they were cataloged in specific ways. I also look at how in these notebooks one finds drawings of strange objects in the sky, drawings every day, not just of sunspots, but in my case, particularly of nebulae. Nebulae over and over and over again, drawing by hand, observing by hand what they're seeing through the telescope every day for, in some cases, for 40, 50 years of work. This is also data collection of visual form. And they were very sensitive to the materials used, the paper used, the graphite of the pencils of the 19th century really mattered to them. And that was determinant for the quality of their data, they believed. Drawing here is the tools and the techniques of drawings used by astronomers overlap almost exactly at the same time in the 19th century with artists using graphite and paper in exactly the same moment, in exactly the same time, in similar ways. I'm very interested in those overlaps between science and art. My latest project is on photography and how photography has also been used in astronomy as a data gathering technique. But once again, I argue it's not a mechanical or automated form. It is implicated with hands, with gelatin, with glass, with chemistry, with wetness and slipperiness, and all the messiness that comes with working with photography and astronomy at this time. Also, data collection also needs to be preserved. Glass plates, very fragile. How do you preserve them? These are some of the questions that come up. Again, human beings are making data, and human beings are implicated in the data making, and the data have contexts and have histories. And that's what we want to continue to echo here. I will give it over to Rohini.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. And can everyone hear me? Yes. Super. I want to say thank you so much for having me, Adrian, Liat, and the Collegium, and of course, Omar. I've known him for, well, of his work for about 10 years, and I'm very excited to be here. I'm going to also give just a brief background so you understand where I'm coming at for this conversation. As Adrian already mentioned, I am a visual artist. I'm based in Delhi, but I'm also an amateur astronomer. And for about 13 years now, I've been working with amateur astronomers in Delhi, working on a form of kind of collective investigation, if you like, where stories, conversations, histories have come together in like a chronicle of this almost obsessive group of people who are transfixed by the night sky, right? And as part of this research, I have traveled across observatories in India and elsewhere, each trip usually focused on a stellar event or site. But as the work has developed, I've become really interested in or conscious of the role of observation, the field, the site in my practice. And I find that these modes are very useful in exploring the relationships between the human and the non-human. So for me, this brings up several questions. How do we construct our environment? How does the environment in turn construct us? What is the position of the observer, the amateur astronomer, or the artist, right? And then how do we place our process and methodologies within the frame of this vast and varied history of techniques of observation, of making sense of reading or recording the Earth, the universe that we are part of. So one of the things that I'm really interested in thinking about, and I've been thinking about it since this conversation and other conversations, is I've never thought of myself as working with data. I work with observations, both my own, those of other people. I work with materials of many different kinds, but I've never used the word data to describe it. And in 2021, I was invited to be an artist in residence at the Open Data Institute in London. And the ODI works with data infrastructure. It focuses on data flows, the data ecosystem. And over the course of the year, I was working with people to try and unpack how different people understand and read data. So what does data mean to different people? And I've realized, of course, I do work with data of many different kinds, which includes the work with astronomy that I do, but also other work. And what changes when you articulate this more clearly, at least when I articulate it more clearly, is that everything, images, frames, constructs, they are all essentially forms of mediation, right? Ways in which to not so much read the environment. It's more a way to read the environment than to quantify it. So for me, what's interesting is that no observation is unmediated. And for me, that asks us to think deeply about the people, the forms, both embodied and technological, as Omar has mentioned, that this mediation takes. So for instance, a recent piece, some of the images of which you will see in the slideshow that is playing right now, is focused on a very historical observatory in the south of India, which is called the Kodaikanal Solar Observatory, where every day, weather permitting, since 1904, the observatory has been recording images of the sun, right? So the piece is called 100,000 Suns, and it's a 4-channel video installation. And here I'm really interested in how the different registers of data play out, right? So we're looking at data that is historical, we're looking at data that is contemporary, and it's also basically asking us to question and think about the ways in which readings and avatars of data will change and will take on different forms, depending on the site, the observer, and, as Omar has already mentioned, the mode and method of observation, collection, and preservation. So 100 years, almost 120 years of solar data is 11 solar cycles. So that's like 157,000 distinct portraits of our nearest star. And these are observations which range from hand-drawn discs, hand-drawn sunspots on small discs of paper. We have glass photographic plates. We have more contemporary, sort of observations, H-alpha, calcium K images. And in the work, what I've done is I have juxtaposed this historical material with material that NASA has made available in the public domain through their Solar Dynamics Observatory, their Virtual Solar Observatory, but also my own data, right? So coming back to the idea of who authors data, is it only data with a big D, you know what I mean? Or is it also, in the case of this work, interviews with amateur astronomers, interviews with eclipse chasers, people who have literally chased the shadow of the moon, So my own eclipse data, because I've chased 3 eclipses as well. And I think what is interesting is, again, this idea of what is data, who is data, why is data collected is all very, very important. And one of the things that, in fact, really triggered the work is that I was having conversations with people at the ODI, and somebody mentioned a digital twin. And many of you may already know what a digital twin is. I didn't at the time. So the digital twin is essentially a concept of 3 parts, right? So it says you have a physical product, you have a digital virtual product, and you have connections between these two, correct? So for instance, you want to create a virtual engine to show how a physical, car engine would work in the real world, right? So you create a digital twin. So these connections between the physical product and the virtual product is the data that flows between them. What's really interesting is that there is talks of a digital replica of the Earth, a digital twin of the Earth, right? That could help scientists model the future of the planet, possibly find solutions wrought by climate change, etc., which I find very interesting, but also a little bit troubling for many reasons, because it sort of presumes that the Earth, this planet, is somehow essentially knowable, right? That its interrelationships can be programmed and somehow digitally rendered without bias. So the work, 100,000 Suns, wasn't a deliberate alternative to the idea of a digital twin, but it was deliberately speculative, deliberately metaphoric, deliberately discrete, deliberately an assemblage of the ways in which we record and observe the sun. And I'm just going to end a little bit just by touching upon, again, what Omar has said, materiality of data, as he said, is something I am also very, very, sort of invested in and interested in. Because, what happens when you take this materiality seriously, right? So in the case of the data that I've worked with at this observatory, as I said, you have drawings of sunspots, which are, of course, created with pencil, but also color pencil on paper. And, you see new ways of mark making. These were all anonymous, but then you can almost sense how maybe some people's gestures, the way somebody's body engages with the material would shift. And in fact, Omar's book, Observing by Hand, which is here, has been hugely relevant to this work because, in particular, Omar, when you talk about the idea of the working image, and you talk about how, each observation was a composite, in many senses. And he can speak to this again. But it was interesting to me because Omar talks about how very often a single observation, so let's speak again specifically about the sunspot, they are recorded over, let's say, a week's period of time, right? So you can almost sense how time is sitting on it, sort of thick, time literally sits on it. It's like an accordion, like he says, it's stretched. But you also talk about what does it require of the observer to draw something that is as unfamiliar as a sunspot. You speak, in the book, it's much more about nebulae, but I could totally extend that to the sunspot, right? So how do you then, what does it mean to draw something that is so strange? And then you talk about repetition, drawing again and again as an act of familiarity. And these, I think, are really interesting, just even in terms of methodology, and just in ways in which you think about what it means to be dealing with material that is also both observation, but it is also all of these kinds of things. And again, as you mentioned, photographic plates, where literally the data is the light that is captured from the sun, but it is also the photoemulsive coating on the glass, and it's that particular moment, and in fact there's one on the screen right now, right? That moment in history when astronomy was collected and preserved on glass. And then with eclipse chasers, data is voice, data is memory, data is emotion, and again, coming back to this idea of the human aspect of data, the eye, the mind, the body, that I think can sometimes be lost when we only think about data as a kind of, sort of objective, neutral sort of entity. Yeah.
Thanks. Rohini, I want to pick up on the last point about the body here. And maybe I could just use this room as an example of that again. One of these, so we think of astronomy with telescopes, obviously, and that's the prime instrument. In fact, with the telescope, typically it came with a chair, a very specific kind of chair that was designed specifically to work in coordination with the telescope. And different telescopes have different kinds of movements, and the body of the astronomer has to be in different kinds of positions. And these chairs that were very task specific and designed to be for astronomy's use were meant to follow these telescopes in their weird positions and places. In fact, I found that the level of comfort of the chairs, of their design, we're talking about the middle of the 19th century, was essential in the minds of those astronomers like Wolf here, for the quality of data that's gotten. So how comfortable the person receiving the data is determines the quality of that data. And they were able to determine that numerically. So the astronomers, because the astronomers were always data scientists right from the beginning, before that term even was invented by Google, by the way, one of the essential things that they did was that they asked the question, does our body actually matter in its level of comfort? Let's determine what statistically we can get from an observation with and without chairs. And then they would use that as a kind of systematic error in their reductions. Okay, so the chair becomes an instrument for data gathering. So the level of comfort, if there were discomfort and too much of their body came into presence, that was detrimental to the data. And that's quite important because it's saying that the body gets in the way, right? The body got in the way of getting the right and valuable data. And this has a long history because in our Western culture, there's a distinct separation between the mind and the body. And there is a real urge deep down inside of us as scientists and as artists to basically access that mental ethereal realm, what we may call the abstract, that abstracts from the bodies. And there's reasons for that that connect to Christianity, to the shaming of the body, to the elevation and transcendence of the mind. That is a reflection. We find that in the data gathering. And that raises another point, and that is data is never just given. It's really needs to be extracted. And work is involved. There's a labor to science, including the science that gathers the data. And that labor, in some cases, has to be very comfortable, as in the case of the astronomers. In other cases, the labor can and should be, and ought to be, excruciatingly painful and difficult. Just think of Humboldt and these people going on expeditions into the unknown world, into the Amazonia, and risking their lives, and risking their bodies, and risking everything around them for the gathering of data, right? Of temperature, of barometer measurements, of measurements of pressure, of measurements of this and that, the height of that mountain, and putting yourself and your body at risk and on the line is also a part of science. And that is also a part of getting the data, acquiring the data, and generating that data. The history of science is replete with either discomfort or the immense amount of discomfort associated with the labor included and the work included in data gathering and generation. And this already points to the fact that no data is a given. And that's not an oxymoron. And I want to explain briefly why. If Rohini allows me, I want to just explain a little bit about the etymology of the word data. Okay? And alchemy, because this is called data alchemy, and I had to think about the alchemy as well. So one of the most important books of the 20th century on the history of alchemy is called The Forge and the Crucible. And it starts really tantalizingly with cosmology. And he says in that book, the author, that the beginnings of alchemy are to be found in the meteorites that fall from the sky, cosmic. And they fall and they literally plant themselves onto the earth, and human beings are introduced thereby to not just a cosmic metal, but to iron, right? This is the introduction of iron. Iron comes from meteorites, especially in the very first Iron Age. Human beings they don't know smelting yet, so they're using iron from meteorites. This is the beginnings of alchemy, according to the historian of alchemy, one of the best in the 20th century. Now, this is also the datum of alchemy. Why? Because the word data derives itself etymologically from a very old Proto-Indo-European word, do, which means to be given. The meteorite is a given from the gods for the generation of the science of alchemy. It appears out of nowhere, and it's cosmic and divine. And it lands in the laps of these people, and they do something with it. But the point here is, the meteorite is a datum. It is a given. In other languages, in Sanskrit, it also has its derivatives, which means the gift. The data, the datum is a gift. In Latin, it becomes the given, right? And so there is, in our culture, in our history, this is part of our subconscious. This is part of how we behave as well to this very day. History shapes who we are today. And part of what, how, and why we assume, and this goes back to Rohini's remarks about the meanings of data, what we assume data to be is very inextricably linked to this legendary origins of alchemy. And that is, data is always going to be a given. right? And it's the labor involved, all the generation of all the preparations we need to receive that data, and perhaps even all the bodies involved, all the blood, sweat, and tears, even the martyrs of science, and that's what they were called in the 19th century, those who lost their lives in the pursuit of data in the jungles of the Sahara. All of that is to be forgotten and relegated to the one side, because data has to become magically and mythologically a given that comes out of nowhere. All we need to do is use it. And this is a deep myth that still drives many of us, that goes back to the origins of alchemy itself. And I want to say, and part of what our work does is it challenges this idea of a data that's given. In fact, that's what's an oxymoron. There is no data that's given. Data is acquired and gathered and generated, and sometimes very laboriously so laboriously that we have an urge to automate it and mechanize it, because the labor that's deemed essential for its gathering is derogatorily made beneath us, right? That's why in the history of science, it was often women or young boys at some point in astronomy who were the data gatherers. They were the human computers, the original computers. They were the ones where that labor, that dredge work was assigned to. Rohini?
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree, because I just think that some of the things we should remember is that data is not a natural phenomena, right? Data is a mirror. Data is imperfect. Data cannot be separated from its context, which is also what you've already touched upon in the first part. And I think why data is collected, by whom it's collected, these are very important questions. So again, if we just look at the work I've already been talking about, the distance between these collections of data is layered and vast, right? So the Kodaikanal Solar Observatory was actually established in 1899 as a solar physics observatory, but it took over the observational activities of the Madras Observatory, which was founded by the British East India Company in 1786. So the hand-drawn observations of the sunspots and the glass photographic plates began when the observatory was still very much an instrument of colonial rule. And in the years, in fact, leading up to the transfer of equipment from Madras to Kodaikanal, India witnessed the Great Famine of 1876, 1878, which was under the Crown rule, right? And the project to monitor sunspot activity daily from Dehradun and later Kodaikanal began in 1878 and was exported to India from Britain by the editor of the journal Nature, Norman Lockyer, who believed that a causal link could be found between sunspot activity and large-scale weather patterns on Earth. And, you know, the historian of science, Simon Sharma, has pointed out, and I'm quoting him, the British government in India built a new solar physics observatory in southern India, and it credited the idea that you could correlate the behavior of the sun with famine, close quotes, right? So this, of course, is a fantasy of control, right? You can predict the behavior of an object far beyond the empire's vantage point rather than looking to your own position, correct? And so again, as you have already said, it is important to remember that data is collected, preserved, and presented by us. And so it has to be seen to be subject to the same biases, the same drivers, the same agendas, the same subjectivities that we, view the world through. Anything else is just, at best a whim and at worst a dangerous delusion. And I think within this frame, if we begin to think about the relationship between data and culture, data and art, I think what art allows is the possibility of subversion, of resistance, of the speculative, of the weird, of the strange. It allows you to upend, again, the idea of the data as a given, this authority that data both implies and explicitly argues for, right? So the speculative argues for mutability and allows many visions of the same thing simultaneously and not necessarily in the same linear timeline. So the minute you ask the question, what if, which is at the core of so much speculative art and fiction, the answers almost always open up wider horizons. And it allows room, for humor, for play, for poetry. And there was a wonderful poet, in fact, Mr. G, who works a lot with data, whose work I came across not so long ago as part of the residency at the ODI. And one of his poems is called All Together Now, and it addresses a lot of what we've been talking about. So I'm just going to quote one line where he says the curation of art is an art form in itself. For art will always bring people together. So we collaborate, we aggregate, we argue, we advocate. And I think it's so interesting, no, if we start to think about curations of data within the frame of art, curations that allow for multiple sites of authorship, stewardship, also messiness, chaos, access. And this is a interesting way to think about data and culture. But the other thing, actually, that Omar, that what you were saying made me think about is, again, the distance between what happens when we have the data that is the given and our lived reality. So just a very simple example, right? If I tell you Saturn, you will immediately have an image in your head. And I'm guessing that the image will be something that was either generated by Cassini or New Horizons or maybe James Webb. But if you go into the field and you look through a telescope for the first time, very often what you see is anticlimactic, right? And you almost always have a reaction which is like, is that all? Is that it? That sort of sense of really? And so there's this distance. And it's only when the astronomer next to you might tell you, okay, well, actually, Saturn is 79, billion kilometers away. It takes that much time for the light from the sun to hit Saturn, to hit the photon receptive, light receptive photons in your eye. So again, it becomes bodily. And then it again becomes visceral. And again, it becomes sort of a shared experience. It's at once individual, it's at once collective. So again, just punching in that thing again, that data is human, because it is. Yeah.
I like this, this idea that it's not just human, but also that we have a hand in it. And this also then speaks also to the aesthetics of data, and perhaps even the visualization of data. And this observatory is also a kind of visualization of data by Gottfried Zempe, the architect who designed this space, who also designed the Hauptgebäude of the ETH, and who designed multiple places, including the amazing Dresden Opera House. But he's probably most well known for his theories. He's a theorist of architecture, and his grand book is called Der Stil, style. So he doesn't speak about patterns, he speaks about styles. And what he does, he says this explicitly. He says, this is Gottfried Zempe, quotation, like the astronomers have found a kind of evolutionary morphology of the nebulae, I'm setting out to find the evolutionary morphology of art. Okay? And what he does is he takes the entirety of the history of art right back to prehistoric times, and he tries to find the morphological, what he calls style, or what we might call patterns, over time that will explain the trajectory and the history of art itself, using these morphological connections. And the starting point for him is very interesting. Very much reminiscent of computer science itself and its history. He starts with textiles and the weaving of the textiles in a certain pattern that's repetitive as the beginnings of all human art, according to Zempe, the guy who made this space. And from those weavings and those interconnections in your cloth, in ancient human clothing, is the beginnings of all of art. So he connects that then to the weaving of baskets, from that to pottery, from pottery to drawing to sculpture, while they're intermixed, right? Depends how you go. But that's his trajectory. And this is according to him an evolution of art that he can retrace according to the patterns he's discovered in the data from his historical research. And so in the arts, and maybe this is perhaps why for an artist like yourself, Rohini, using the word data perhaps is not at the forefront, but for a historian, it very much is. We're functioning not, the words we might use as historians is not so much data, it's actually the facts. We try to gather the facts and build up a story from them. whereas an artist, basically, according to this Zemperian point of view, is actually playing out, despite herself or himself, a kind of teleological evolution of art, despite themselves and despite the data. They are basically, creating what needs to be done next in this long evolutionary history of art. And this building here, designed by Zempa, has actually some signs of that, but I don't want to get into that right now. So yeah, and so there's this interplay between the sciences and the arts, and not just at the level of the gathering of data, perhaps from the pencils or the paint, or from the writing or from the photography, but also very much at the level of how sciences, the latest sciences of the 19th century, even impacted how artists and art theoreticians thought about art itself and the uses of patterns.
I absolutely agree. I quite like the idea that there's some kind of sort of longer history that one is sort of, yeah, I'm sure one is. No, I like this idea also, because I think actually this idea of patterns and the way that patterns also play out in many different registers and scales is something that I'm also very interested in. And the piece, in fact, that's part of Data Alchemy, Glasshouse Deep, is a sort of another body of my work, which is all about pattern and pattern recognition. And it's a lot of work with video feedback, which is literally the most incredible thing. And I'm not going to get into the technical aspects of video feedback and how incredibly strange it is, but it is very much about sort of an instinctive sort of, seeking for pattern, but also a way in which pattern kind of is both embedded within the material. And it's a really interesting how in video feedback, sort of like in printmaking, the conceptual somehow is embedded in the material. Do you know what I mean? It's very strange. It doesn't make any sense because I haven't explained what video feedback is, but it's essentially when a loop of light is created or a loop is created between a camera and a TV, and then you generate forms that start to mimic biological life. We don't need to get into, the details of that. The work is in, I think, the space that Adrian mentioned, so you can go and check that out. But no, I absolutely agree. And it's interesting how, in fact, with this particular piece, the work began with an interest in diatoms and marine biology and this idea of symmetry and bilateral symmetry, radial symmetry, but it became actually a story about the very minute, assuming a sort of planetary scale. So in a strange way, it also came very close to the work that I do with this. So yeah, I do think that these things, yeah, similar to how, when we were working on the video, there were these incredible conjunctions where one of your images was speaking to mine and the other way around. And it's just, some of it was deliberate, but some of it was just incredible conjunctions, I would say. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So like this idea of patterns is very interesting for the reasons that I want to echo off of you. And that is, and this will now get into a little bit of astrology as well. Okay. And the history of the occult and the human, which is a part of our history, and that is what Zemper is getting at, and what others were getting at, was these patterns. We also find that patterns were being marked on human bodies as tattoos. Prehistorical man was very much an ornamental man, woman, person, and these ornamentations, according to Zempa, was a part of this level of a lower level in the scale of human evolution, but it's very much a part of our who we are. We're pattern makers, we're pattern finders, and we're an ornamentation, whether on our clothing, on our bodies, on our buildings, in our furniture, is very much what makes us human. It's a reflection of our pattern recognition abilities. And that's why many of the theorists of anthropology and art history of the 19th century identified ornamentation as an early human phenomenon. This will change when Adolf Loos, the architect, the Viennese architect, he will basically say in 1910, we as modernists are done with ornamentation. We are now modern. We are no longer pre-modern. The sign of a modern man, according to him, is no ornament, and thus the bareness of our walls in modern architecture, right? So we as moderns have excluded the ornament as a primitive form of who we were, but no longer are. We are ornamentless. The original meaning of cosmos it's a Greek word. And the original meaning of cosmos, again, etymology, it means ornament. The cosmos is the original ornament. It's the original pattern. And this is extremely important. I want to make this point because what we are today is different from what we were yesteryear, consciously, like Adolf Loos has separated us from our history. For the ancient world, for most of human history, most human cultures, the cosmos is a pattern that reflects patterns in us. Very important to many cosmologies across the world. And that what we have inside patterns the things outside. That was never a problem. There's no distinction between the subjective and objective. That distinction, I could literally give you the date of when that distinction happens. And that's literally at the end of the 1800s, okay? 1700s. In the 1780s, those words get introduced in the way that we know it today. Before that, all of human history had no problem with finding patterns in oneself that reflect patterns in the cosmos, and the cosmos reflecting patterns in us. That is the essence of why things like astrology work. And that's why most of medicine and the history of medicine has been astrological. In most civilized human cultures like the Chinese, the Indo cultures, the Muslim, even the Christian world, the medieval Christian world, these were to gain access to your ailment as a doctor. I need to understand the astrological patterns that reflect back to the sky, because that's how I will understand your cure. Because there is no conflict here between a pattern that I have, that's subjective, we think of as today, and what's objective out there in the world. And that patterning, those patterns that we find in the world and that we find in ourselves are echoing one another. And those who recognize those echoes were the experts, right? Those were the scientists. What happens, though, is after Kant, that's after the 1780s, we get this huge split between the patterns out there in the world become real, and the patterns that we find in ourselves become less real, subjective. And then the task of data analysis becomes essentially to figure out the signal from the noise. The noise here being, in often cases, what we are projecting. And the signal we want is the objective thing out there in the world. That split only happens very recently. And that split also splits us in our understanding of patterns. Astrology will no longer make sense. Astromedicine will no longer make sense in this world, where patterns are not echoing one another, rather they're distinct. And so the whole science of psychoanalysis will begin to be an analysis of the patterns of the self that are then not necessarily at all connected to the patterns of the world. And many of the sciences will be sciences of the world and its patterns that may not necessarily have any connection or ought not to have any connection with the patterns we find in ourselves, right? Otherwise, that would be subjective. This is a recent phenomena. Human history and its data gathering and its recognition of patterns was a very different phenomena before even just 150 years ago. So in our discussions of what of what data meant in its history and what patterns mean. We need to be very sensitive about when we're talking about these things occurring.
Super. It's so interesting. So the community of people that I have worked with for so long, for them, the word, I'm not kidding, the word astrology is a huge trigger. Not kidding. And yet,
which word? I didn't hear it.
Astrology.
Astrology, yes,
like,
of course.
Huge trigger. But in all of the interviews that I did with many amateur astronomers, the questions that I would ask them is, so what draws them to the night sky, right? Why do they continue to do what they do? And so many of them describe moments of sort of lying under the night sky. Like one particular amateur astronomer, Vishnu, describes lying under the night sky. And he says, I feel a wave pass between me. It goes up to the stars. It comes back to me. And he says, I just start weeping. I'm not sad. I'm not anything. It's just, I feel a connection, right? Something is out there. And I have done a sound piece. It's not part of Shadow Walkers, but it is. And in fact, words like rapture don't feel out of place when you listen to these conversations, right? When you describe an eclipse chaser's eclipse chase, you could think of that as a pilgrimage. And I remember, we share a common acquaintance with Lorraine Daston at the Max Planck Institute when she was director. And I remember asking her this question about how I felt like there was quite a lot of interesting sort of, weird echoes or resonances between spirituality or even religion and astronomy. And she had an interesting perspective. She felt that it's possible. I mean, I don't want to upset anybody, but her words were that, it's possible that, a religion may have actually taken some of those feelings that come from astronomy. And so this language, I think, in fact, is quite shared, in the sense that you could see how this would happen. But so many of the amateur astronomers do exactly what you're describing. They read into the sky, right? So many of them have favorite objects in the night sky. A sound piece of mine, another work of mine, Raj talks about the sun as being his favorite object in the night sky because it's the one object he can't look at, right? Then he talks about the sun as being a parent. Then he talks about his own, there's ways in which people read into the sky, read into celestial objects. And I think it just is a wonderful way to think about what you have just said, and to say also that I agree with you. And I also feel like maybe this is how people then try and find other ways of making those patterns make sense again, because I do think this is a very human thing, which is why actually the amateur astronomer is so central to my work, because it's what it means to be human, right? To try and make sense of these things. It's how we read our position in everything around us. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so the mechanization then of currently today of predictions from those patterns, no longer as a human thing, but as a computerized thing, is outsourcing what was very much a human quality to a machine on the premise that it will do it objectively. What that premise doesn't realize is that that machine is basically just reflecting us. We are its cosmos, right? Just as the cosmos was for us a pattern of ourselves, the machine's mass acquirement of trillions of data points is from the internet, is our darkest subconscious as well as our conscious, all put together, and we become its reflection. On the presumption, on our belief and our hope that it is therefore objective, because it's separated from us. It's a machine doing it. And so that excludes the kinds of emotions that are connected with the Rohini, because data gathering is emotional. In all of the history of science, it is extremely emotional and is spoken up of in religious terms. Like I mentioned, it even you also find in the literature right into the 20th century words like the martyrs of science. They were martyred for the sake of science in their projects to gather data in the risks that they took. Now, I think that we also need to think about not just like these patterns, lines in the world that we begin to see, but the infrastructures that make possible the data, and the riskiness of Western scientific man who, as an adventurer, will go out into the world and conquer it. Those infrastructures, since the 1600s right up to the 20th century, are imperial infrastructures. Those same infrastructures will become the basis, the substrate for railway lines, which will become the substrates for telegraph lines, which will become the substrates for fiber optic lines, which become the infrastructure for our digital world that's made possible by these infrastructures that are material, that are stratified upon an imperial basis that goes back at least to be forgotten, that on the back lays upon which we can be the heroic, adventurous, and discomforted scientist in pursuit of data.
We are unfortunately running out of time, but it was very interesting to listen to your conversation. It was like, okay, wow, our exhibition makes a lot of sense. And in the beginning, I said we won't be talking about AI, but actually we talked only about AI, more or less, how AI also today is lacking, again, this kind of bodily experience and part, and the intelligence that is created over there is just a kind of objective kind of mind intelligence. No? But maybe we can have one or two questions. Are there any questions in the audience? Yes. I'll use the microphone so Rohini can also hear you.
I am Alex, not yet a student of neuroscience at ETH, so fortunately I will maybe get there soon, but let's see. Okay, I would like to start my intervention. It might take 2 minutes, I don't know if that will be correct, but I would like to start by defining information. And in my opinion, the definition of information that we have, or the best I've seen, is what allows you to get from point A to point B in a non-random way. So what takes are among all the possibilities in the universe, what makes you go from A to B in a direct line, eliminating all redundant movement, is information. That's the definition of information, I would say. And then you made a claim that all observations are mediated. And there's a really interesting Buddhist concept, which is that we only perceive our instrument when it is not perfectly calibrated. When it is perfectly calibrated, we see the universe, and when it is not, we stop using the universe. We stop seeing the universe, and we start seeing the instrument itself. And from that, I would like to put an analogy with our human body, that you only notice your feet when they ache, and this is precisely why we should get the chair you mentioned correct. If we do not, the time investment of smart people in something superfluous will be huge, and that's a huge cost at a societal level. And I would like to finish my intervention by saying that there's a distinction between astrology and astronomy, and I think that you nailed it when you mentioned that the distinction between subjective and objective occurred a few centuries ago, and I think that is in relationship to what I mentioned before about information, that it occurred when we noticed that there's a distinction between objective and subjective because of the noticing that our tools of observation, be it our brains, our minds, or our eyes, are not perfectly calibrated. So we see our tools of observation and we do not see the universe. That's why extrapolating from the patterns we see in ourselves might not be appropriate because they are not perfectly calibrated.
Thank you very much. So I like this very much, this kind of approach, but when we do history, we try not to take the standpoint of ourselves and think we're at the pinnacle, we know it all. They may have had it right as well. What the power of doing history, especially of the history of science, is not that it will help us to instruct us on how to get it right and not wait for the things to go wrong, but to learn from the past and so anticipate when things might go wrong. But even more powerfully, it's meant to show us that the path we've taken here is contingent. It's not inevitable. It could have been otherwise. There's nothing essential to it being so that objective and subjective are real distinctions in the sense that Kant had it. It is a historical phenomena that unravels itself in very contingent ways that led us to this point that could have been otherwise, right? So what I'm asking you to do is not believe in astrology. I'm asking to imagine yourself in a world where it was taken seriously. And what did they understand? Patterns. And maybe by doing that, we may be able to widen our own horizons today because we are so much so. History helps us to do that, right? To think along the lines of other human beings, to accept them as human beings, as smart, if not smarter than us, in other times, in other places, who said other things and understood the cosmology of the world in different ways. In fact, even the word intelligence, the way we use it today, has no resonance with the ancient world. Even as far back as if you go to medieval text, they will use intelligence in a very different way than we do. In fact, they will, it's maybe important to say this, they will distinguish, there's a sharp distinguishment that goes all the way back. You will find this in 16th century text, 17th century text, all the way back to Aristotle. 2,000 years of human history. The understanding was, in multiple cultures, so this is not just the Western world, is that reason is one thing, reason is inferior to the intellectus, the intellect. Reason is a calculator, it's a calculating machine. Reason is just practicalities. But reason as a faculty is distinct from another faculty called intellect. The intellect is a higher faculty. It governs the rationale, the reason. And it governs it in a way that controls reason, because reason can go, it's a tool, it could go wrong. You could become very practical at being evil. Intellect will govern that and control that. The intellect is divine. The intellect has a connection to the cosmic world, according to this view. The intellect, therefore, is not to be equated or conflated with reason at all. These are two extremely different things. And much of the history of philosophy in our own culture, if that's not understood, it will be majorly confused, okay? So the way we use intelligence today and artificial intelligence is what they would understand by the faculty of reason, not intellectus. Intellectus is wisdom. It's different. And it seems the way we use intellect today, or the artificial intelligence, is really a non-governed reason of practicalities and calculations. You see how that opens up a whole different kind of worms. That's the power of history. It makes you think about your own notions. So I'm not asking you to believe that notion of intellect. I'm asking you to suspend judgment, to take it on board, to understand it, to think about it, and then open yourself up to it. And it may change your views about what you take to be intellect today.
I'm just going to jump in here very quickly to add to this, because it's a perfect segue. Thank you for that, Omar. Again, speaking to history, I recently finished a project with a wonderful performance artist, once based in Switzerland, now in Berlin, Region 7. And in fact, our work was exactly about this. We were looking at the histories of the observations of Saturn, right? The earliest observations of Saturn when Galileo first saw Saturn, and the fact that actually for almost 50, 60 years, Saturn's rings could not be resolved. And it's not because the telescopes were not good enough, although in the beginning, literally, I mean, there's wonderful text which it's just too much, but there's a lot of wonderful writings and letters that he's written where he describes Saturn as a three-bodied planet, as something which seems to have three bodies because his telescope couldn't resolve the rings, right? But over the next 50 years, we see illustrations, we see drawings of Saturn, which we now recognize to be rings. And yet it was not until Huygens that it was rings, right? The problem of Saturn's, it was called the problem of Saturn's ansys or handles. So this idea of this kind of distance between what they were seeing and what they were perceiving and not being able to make that sort of intellectual jump is something that I think has a lot of resonance between an amateur somebody who's never looked through a telescope, who looks at Saturn for the first time and goes, is that all? Again, there is distance between what you see and what you expect to see. And in fact, we had curated an overnight observation where we took a group of, it was a mixed group, people who had experience looking through a telescope, people who had never had experience looking through a telescope. And a curator, artist, collaborator, Jivesh Bagchi, looked through it and he wrote a piece about this later, and he describes it as a search for language. He says you have to unpack the way that you are used to seeing. You have to find a new way to look. So I think that's absolutely true. I think that there's something that happened when those historical sort of observations of Saturn and the fact that actually there was this distance, and then this very contemporary experience of distance between what you imagine and what you hope to see is also, so basically I think I think what Omar is also pointing to is these kind of spaces in between that become very rich, ripe spaces, very productive spaces for art, for many things. Yeah.
Thank you, Rohini. And Omar, are there any last questions? Otherwise we can... No? Okay.
Okay, I think there's... Okay. I think there's the distinction you made between intellect, reason, and maybe you would also...
I didn't make it.
Okay, not you, but the reason...
2,000 years of history.
The logic which transcends you and me, I think is wrong in the sense that we also make a distinction between emotion and reasoning, and there's nothing apart from emotion, in my opinion. I think there's quite a bit research in neuroscience backing my claims, in the sense that you're all now evaluating my claims in the sense that they make sense or not. There's something in you now pointing towards the rightness or the wrongness of my speech. And that thing is itself an emotion. So we have nothing apart from emotions. And that's where I would come by saying that there's no distinction between intellect, reason, and emotion.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the conversation, for the insights, and thank you for attending. As mentioned, there's some refreshments outside.
Thank you.